On the 31st of October 1517, the foundations of the Protestant Reformation were laid when Martin Luther reputedly nailed his 95 Theses to the door of All Saints' Church in Wittenberg, a town in the German state of Saxony-Anhalt. As a disputation, the theses were designed to be points for theological debate, primarily around the practice of selling indulgences. But the political and religious climate of the time, combined with the recent invention of the printing press, meant that Luther's document ended up being circulated to a much wider audience. Officially titled the 95 Theses on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences, Luther had sought to engage the church authorities in a debate over the effect of earthly deeds on a soul's salvation. The frankly more exciting tradition that he angrily nailed a list of grievances to the door of the church is therefore highly unlikely. Modern scholars now suggest that Luther wrote to the bishop on the 31st of October and, after failing to receive a response, began circulating his theses amongst his friends. Luther's particular concern was the church practice of selling indulgences, those sales which had a promise that a buyer's sins would be absolved. However, he also shone light on the papacy's extraction of money from the poor in order to build St. Peter's Basilica, which he thought was strange and somewhat hypocritical that the papacy was doing this rather than using its own financial reserves. It's therefore no surprise that the 95 Theses made their way to Rome, where the Pope condemned them. 2 years later, Pope Leo X issued a papal bull that led to Luther's excommunication, but was unable to stop the Protestant Reformation.
Over 100 years ago, in the 1880s, to honor the birth, the 400th anniversary of the birth of Martin Luther, the city fathers built behind us this wonderful collection of statues to men of faith who prepared the way for Martin Luther and prepared the way for the Protestant Reformed Reformation Church of the 16th century. In the middle of the collection of wonderful statues is Martin Luther, but also there's the statue of Peter Waldo, the Waldensian, the man who epitomized what the suffering persecution of the Inquisition accomplished by literally destroying a whole population of people. Scripture was corrupt in the Latin. It had been made so by a dishonest church, by a church that would twist and pervert even Scripture in order to accomplish their agenda. And it's a wonderful, passionate story that each one of them brings to the overall success that the Reformation was able to afford us all. Martin Luther came to Wittenberg in 1508. It wasn't by accident. He was chosen by the secret society of Lollards to come here and chair the professorship of philosophy. As he developed and matured in his studies in the 13 years that led up to the Diet of Worms in 1521, that event being preceded by Erasmus's Greek-Latin Bible, printed in 1516, and the combination of events that happened in this city on Halloween in 1517, at which time Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg door of the Castle Church right behind me. Luther was ready in 1517 to proclaim the message of faith. You study the Scriptures, you search the Scriptures, Martin Luther said, in order to know God and to know His promises. Because you see, from his study of the 11th chapter of Hebrews and the 6th verse, without acting on the promises, it's impossible to please God. Martin Luther's conversion came from a study of the book of Habakkuk in an indirect way from the 2nd chapter and the 4th verse. He remembered a passage that the just shall live by his faith. In Martin Luther's subsequent study of the book of Romans, the 1st chapter and the 17th verse, he read, the just shall live by faith. The just shall live by acting on the promises. From 1516 to 1546, Martin Luther only preached one message from this pulpit in this church. Hebrews 11, verse 1, faith, that is, acting on the promises, is defined as the sure confidence, the invisible reality, the ground of the heart of things hoped for. In the United States, we celebrate our Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July because on that day in 1776, the Founding Fathers, risking everything, put their signature to a document proclaiming their liberty and their freedom. On the 17th day of April in 1521, as Christians around the world, that is our Declaration of Independence Day, because one man stood against the emperor and against his critics and against those that would have him burned at the stake in this building behind me, the Cathedral of Worms in Germany. And Martin Luther, that man, that monk, stood before his inquisitors and stood before those who sought to slay him. He stood before him with the fullest comprehension that that was going to be his last day on earth. And he declared for you and for me as Christians our independence.
As he stood in front of the court, he made one of the most remarkable speeches in history. A speech that would take only 10 seconds to deliver. My conscience is my guide. Scripture is my authority, and I can do no other than abide by its teachings. Here I stand. God help me. Luther was convinced that he would be burned at the stake, but his friends kidnapped him and took him to Prince Frederick's castle in Wartburg. With the help of Erasmus's Greek-Latin Bible, he translated the Bible into the German language in 90 days. The first copies came off the press in September of 1522. The driving force in Martin Luther's life was the fear of God. With William Tyndale, it was the belief that God had chosen him that possessed him. Their love and respect for God overcame their personal fears and persuaded them to undertake a work that, from a human perspective, was virtually impossible. Tyndale would have failed without Luther, and Luther would have failed without Tyndale.